At midnight on January 1st, 2026, Zohran Mamdani became New York City's new mayor. During the election, your feed was probably filled with one topic: taxes. But almost no one answered the most important question. Does the mayor of New York actually have the power to change them? Does Mamdani's win make any difference? In this video, we'll break down what New Yorkers voted for, what they already pay, and whether or not all that talk about Mamdani's tax policies was even worth your attention. To kick us off, what did nearly 1 million New Yorkers just vote for? Mamdani primarily promised to make the city more affordable. He wanted to make buses free, which is not happening by the way, freeze the rents, raise the minimum wage, but most importantly, he aligned himself with the policy that his detractors and election opponents absolutely avoided: taxing the rich. And this very same policy would primarily be achieved through increasing tax rates on incomes above $1 million and slapping an additional 2% tax on top of it, and then increasing the state corporate income tax rate from 7.25% to 11.5%, an almost 4% increase. In less inflammatory language, and in an effort to keep the peace, these ideas and policies relate to the concept of tax fairness. Tax fairness can find its roots in Adam Smith's 4 canons of taxation, one of which is the canon of equity. Roughly speaking, that's the fact that those with more should bear a heavier tax burden. And through the continued development of economics combined with good jurisprudence, the canon of equity formed into the modern conception of tax fairness. Nowadays, tax fairness calls for tax policy to be structured in such a way so that the burden of taxation is distributed fairly among citizens according to their ability to pay. This creates the underlying policy guidance that the more you earn, the more you should pay. And on its face, this is the accepted fair way of doing things, and is the reason why nearly all countries have what's called a progressive rate structure: tax rates that go up for increasing amounts of income. This means that in theory, and practically in reality, a lawyer pays more tax than a line cook, a successful brick-and-mortar business person might pay more than that lawyer, and a software billionaire should pay more than all of them. And when politicians aligned with Mamdani and their supporters say tax the rich, this is the exact core idea being targeted. The more wealth you have is the more tax you should and could pay. One thing that has to be said though is that there are many ways of interpreting this goal. You can believe that the rich pay no tax at all, or you can have the more realistic and grounded view that the rich can pay less tax than they should fairly pay because of access to expensive and creative tax advisors. Mamdani's tax policy is specifically aimed at taxing the wealthiest city in America's wealthiest residents, the 100 or so billionaires in the city, and everyone who's a runner-up as 100 millionaires and millionaires. Whether or not they're paying sufficient amounts of tax is a whole other discussion that we'll save for another time. But generally, it's been found that the wealthiest 1% pay at least 40% of the city's revenues. And a more important question: can the city's voters get what they voted for? But what is there to change? Let's start by tallying up the taxes that the residents, and especially the rich, already pay. New York is one of the highest tax states in the US. We can kick off the list with its state income tax, which is layered onto your federal tax liabilities. And then if you live in the city, you're also subject to a city income withholding tax on top of your federal and state liabilities. So immediately, you're hit with 4 layers of direct income taxes: federal, state, city, and payroll, which includes items like Social Security and Medicaid. That automatically eats a huge chunk out of your salary. I mean, just compare it to if you lived in Miami or Houston, where immediately you're not hit with a state level income tax. But also, we should compare the cities themselves. New York City is 9 million people on its own, and it takes a lot of planes, trains, and automobiles to get those 9 million people moving. And there's also a lot of infrastructure around keeping those 9 million people safe. So of course, there's going to be a higher revenue demand, and of course, a higher taxation. So assuming that they're resident, that is, if they live or are employed in New York and New York City, and they're salaried, the highest earners, or quote-unquote the salaried rich in the city, are very much taxed. But as you can already guess, it doesn't end at income taxes. So let's run through a couple other taxes that everyone, and generally the rich, pay directly or indirectly while they live in the state and city. So we've already got the income taxes. There's also capital gains taxes if you buy and hold and sell assets. There's also the property tax. And when you die, you get tagged by estate taxes. And when you're living, you're paying sales and use taxes on nearly everything besides food staples and really specific exempt items. That's a lot of taxes, and these are just for employed people. We're not even covering the liabilities business owners face and the liabilities that companies face. And considering all these taxes that I just listed out, we can state that in theory, New York's taxes are already heavily geared towards progressivity, and the wealthiest individuals and companies should, in fact, pay the lion's share of taxes. From this standpoint, it's possible to see that increasing these taxes and increasing revenue would lead to more public spending and eventually increased affordability, what every Mamdani voter voted for. We now see the levers that the powers that be can pull to achieve certain goals. Higher earners fund the system, but still everyone feels the cost of taxation because that's how wide the net is still cast. I mean, sales tax itself has been argued time and time again to be regressive. It eats up more share of income the less income you have. And we're also glossing over the fact that tax strategy and economic burden shifting can also result in the rich paying less, and everyone else, the middle class, paying more. Without turning this video into an entirely different essay, we're going to draw our first conclusion here. New Yorkers, and wealthy New Yorkers at that, pay a load in taxes to keep the city and state moving. And what matters is not taxing more, it's about closing loopholes and strategies to ensure that tax is fairly paid. But, Mr. Internet Taxman, why your knickers in a twist over all the talk about Mamdani from both sides of the political spectrum? Well, it's over the second half of this video, figuring out whether or not New Yorkers will get what they kind of voted for, increased affordability through more aggressive taxation. And the question we now have to ask is, how are the taxes we listed above controlled? So let's set up this little tax tug-of-war game. On one end, we have Mamdani, the mayor-elect of New York City, a sub-state level municipality of the state of New York, and on the other hand, we have the state of New York, which is governed by its own constitution and has its own separation of powers with the legislature, executive, and judiciary branch. And we have our taxes in between them. And what are taxes? Are they A, numbers on a nifty little spreadsheet in the Treasury Department? B, a random number that the reigning power gets to choose on a random basis? Or C, laws? Well, yeah, C is the correct answer. All of tax are laws. The numbers aren't decided and chosen on a random basis, and they're fairly fixed for a set period. They're originally numbers in a code that forms a body of laws that govern this country. More contextually, at the state level in New York, they fall under Chapter 60 of the Consolidated Laws of New York, which covers the things we've just talked about: corporation tax, personal income tax, the city personal income tax, estate taxes, and sales taxes, and all the cool other minute little taxes that we can cover later. And that's all to say that everything that everyone talks about when it comes to taxes are all contained in legislation. They're laws. And in order to, affect the most minute change to all of the taxes we just mentioned, and to provide a nice cash cow to fund the ambition of increasing affordability in the city, we need to change laws. And to change laws, what do? Engage in the legislative process. In New York, like many other states and the federal government, we have a state legislature, which functions alongside the state judiciary and executive, forming the balance of three powers that underpin modern democratic or quasi-democratic governments. And we won't get into the discussion of classifying those because we're not really into that. In New York, legislative power rests with the state Senate and Assembly, as outlined by the New York State Constitution. In order to get the tax rates changed, and to add more taxes, Mamdani would have to somehow lobby or convince state legislators to sponsor and introduce a bill amending the state tax laws to revise rates upwards, or in an extreme chain of events, even introduce that new tax that he wants to. Now, the whole legislative process in itself is one thing, but at the end of the day, the houses have to vote and pass the bill to make the amendment, and the governor, currently Governor Hochul, has expressed support for Mamdani, but not necessarily his tax positions, and she has to sign off on them at the end of the day. The same thing occurs at even the city level, with New York having its own council and legislative process, requiring Mamdani to perform the same appeals, the same garnering of support and lobbying, albeit in a zone where he has a tad bit more control and influence. So as we can see, tax reform isn't an easy thing to do, even if it's just adjusting rates and margins. So no, Mamdani can't raise taxes so easily, but what the mayor can do is adjust budget allocations and improve enforcement mechanisms. Both of these items are well within the office of the mayor of New York City. For example, he could boost funding allocations towards housing initiatives, boost investments into infrastructure to make it more efficient and cheaper, and he could try to make buses free, which again, it's not happening. Of course, none of this is free, All of it is paid by tax revenues and other sources of income the city and state may have. So why not improve the revenue collection? Not by raising the rates, but increasing enforcement of tax collections, increasing the efficiency of tax collections as well, not just cutting down on sources of evasion and avoidance by tightening the valves, but also improving existing systems to make paying taxes a little bit more easy. And here is where tax administration comes into play, something that is as powerful and as important as policy design. And it's much more under the control of Mamdani. And this is where Mamdani can have the most impact on taxes in New York. So what have we learned? Well, New Yorkers already pay a lot of taxes, and wealthy New Yorkers pay a quite bit, ignoring potential efficiencies their tax lawyers and CPAs cook. In order to tax the rich and raise taxes, Mamdani can't just do this on a whim. There's a solid legislative process that needs to be performed before someone could follow through on their tax policies. And it's tougher to pull it off in real life, considering all the stakeholders and pressures at play in tax legislation. And lastly, if Mamdani can't raise taxes, he could increase enforcement and efficiency and budget to meet his promises. Will his voter base get what they wanted in the end? Only time will tell. But at least now we know that unlike what people are farming views and controversy on the internet may say, Mamdani is not the tax mastermind and maniac they make him out to be.